They said the decision wasn't personal. That's what stung most. That cold, rehearsed line from the HR director as she slid the envelope across the polished table. I'd spent 34 years in that building, watched 3 CEOs come and go, trained half the people who now called me ma'am, with polite smiles that felt like condolences. But today, I was just another cost reduction. Another outdated fixture in a hallway of glass and ambition. I remember staring at the silver clock behind her head, thinking how it looked exactly like the one I'd ordered for the executive wing 20 years ago. Even that clock had outlasted me. They called it a strategic restructuring. What they meant was too old to look innovative, too seasoned to be cheap. I signed the papers because I couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't betray the tremor in my throat. The HR director's perfume smelled like lilac and lemon, sharp and sweet, too young for the room. She avoided my eyes. My manager, Melissa Kane, 32, all sharp angles and endless energy, leaned forward to deliver the corporate condolences. You've been an incredible mentor, Diana. We just need to move toward a fresher brand identity. Fresher. That word sat in my chest like vinegar. When I walked out of that building, a box in my arms, the security guard who once greeted me every morning didn't even look up. My badge was already deactivated. I stood in the parking lot, watching sunlight reflect off the glass facade, thinking how I'd spent more years inside that place than outside it. Every project, every late night, every sacrificed weekend evaporated into polite applause and an escort to the elevator. People talk about anger as heat. Mine felt cold, like a winter wind that sneaks into the bones. I sat in my car staring at the envelope that contained my severance, 12 weeks' pay for 3 decades of loyalty. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues I'd once called friends. So sorry, Diana, this is awful. They're making a mistake. Let's catch up soon. None of them would. We all knew that. The humiliation wasn't in being fired. It was in realizing how easily I'd been erased. The meetings I once led would go on without me. My name would fade from the project templates. In 2 months, a new head of operations would be giving tours in my old office, pointing at charts I had drawn. At home, my husband tried to console me. You've worked too hard for too long, he said. Maybe this is your chance to breathe. He meant well, but his words landed softly against the steel inside me. Breathing wasn't what I needed. I needed to matter again. That night, I opened my laptop out of habit, checking emails that no longer belonged to me. The system had already revoked my access. I sat staring at the login screen, my reflection faint in the monitor. The woman looking back at me wasn't tired. She was empty, like a room after a party everyone had left. I thought of all the younger hires I'd mentored, bright, restless, always rushing toward something. I'd covered their mistakes, soothed their panic, taught them how to make decisions when the data was unclear. I'd been the steady one, the anchor. Yet when they looked at me now, they saw a relic. Someone who remembered paper memos and face-to-face apologies. The next morning, I put on my work clothes anyway. It was reflex. The pressed blazer, the small gold earrings, the sensible heels. I made coffee and sat by the window as if waiting for the day to begin. But the silence was loud. Every minute felt like a reminder that I had been replaced by a newer version of myself, one with fewer wrinkles and less patience. I thought about calling Melissa just to ask why me, but I already knew the answer. She'd once told me over lunch, half laughing, "You're the best stabilizer we have, Diana, but sometimes we need disruption." She meant youth. She meant someone whose resume looked fresh on LinkedIn. Around noon, I drove past the office. Through the glass, I saw the team gathered in the conference room, my old seat empty, a new face standing near the whiteboard. For a moment, I imagined walking in, reclaiming that chair, reminding them who had built those systems they now relied on. But I didn't. I just watched until the traffic light changed and the building slipped out of the rearview mirror. That night, the cold anger melted into something else, a strange clarity. Beneath the pain, I felt a pulse of defiance. If they thought I was obsolete, maybe I could prove them wrong. I didn't know how yet, only that the story wasn't ending here. I remember whispering to myself before bed, almost like a vow. They may have taken my title, but they haven't taken my time. I didn't sleep much. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't just grieving. I was planning, though I didn't yet know for what. The first Monday without work felt like standing in an empty station long after the last train had gone. The world kept moving, but my rhythm was gone. No meetings to prepare for, no reports to send, no reason to check my phone every 10 minutes. The silence was merciless. At first, I tried to fill it with noise. I turned on the TV, the radio, even the washer, anything to drown the hum of my own thoughts. But there's a limit to how long you can run from stillness. Eventually, the house swallowed every sound, and I had to listen. I realized how long it had been since I'd noticed the morning light. It poured through the curtains, soft and forgiving, like it had been doing every day of those 34 years I'd spent under fluorescent lamps. I'd been so busy proving my worth that I'd missed half my life's quiet beauty. Still, that didn't make the silence kind. It made it honest. I walked through the rooms of my house like a guest. The hallway photos looked back at me. Weddings, vacations, company events. In one of them, a much younger me stood on a stage holding an award for Employee of the Year. My hair was darker, my smile wider, my future certain. I touched the frame and wondered when that certainty had begun to fade. Lydia, my daughter, called that afternoon. She lives 3 states away, runs a small design firm, and carries the same stubborn streak I once had. "Mom, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I lied. She hesitated. Fine, or pretending to be fine?" "Somewhere in between." There was a pause. "You always said work wasn't who you were. Maybe this is your chance to prove it." Her words sat in my chest all evening. Maybe I had built too much of my identity around that title on my business card. Without it, I didn't quite know who Diana Wren was anymore. By the 3rd day, I started writing lists, small practical things to keep myself steady. Groceries, bills, people to return calls to. But the list I didn't write was the one that haunted me, things I never did because work came first. On Thursday, I drove to the coast. It's a 2-hour ride from my home, and for years I told myself I was too busy. I sat on a weathered bench watching gulls dive and children chase the waves. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't responsible for anyone. The air smelled of salt and change. I should have felt free, but I only felt irrelevant. There's a strange loneliness in realizing the world doesn't miss you. My team had moved on. The company kept running. The daily emails and problems that once seemed essential were now someone else's concern. I'd spent decades believing the place would crumble without me. It didn't, but somewhere beneath the sadness, something faint began to stir, like a seed cracking underground. Maybe irrelevance wasn't a sentence. Maybe it was space. That night, I found myself opening my old notebooks, pages of handwritten ideas I'd never had time to chase. Process improvements, training concepts, even sketches for a mentorship platform that would connect older professionals to startups. Wisdom on demand, I'd once called it. My old self had been too busy maintaining order to explore possibility. I read until midnight, surrounded by scraps of paper and cold tea. A thought formed, fragile, barely daring to exist. What if I built something of my own? Not to prove my worth to Melissa or anyone else, but to reclaim the part of me that believed experience still mattered. Still, courage doesn't appear all at once. The next morning, doubt crept in like fog. Who would invest in someone my age? What do I even know about running a business? I almost laughed. 34 years of keeping one alive apparently didn't count when the voice in your head says you're finished. Later that week, Leo Trent called. Leo had been my mentor years ago, retired now but still sharper than anyone in that building. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice roughened by time. "News travels fast. They'll regret it." I smiled sadly. "Maybe, but that won't give me back my badge." He paused. "Maybe you don't need one. You still have what they don't, clarity. Use it before it fades." After we hung up, I sat with his words. Clarity. It sounded like both a gift and a dare. For the first time since leaving the company, I slept deeply that night. The silence no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like permission. When I woke, I opened my laptop, not to check a schedule, but to open a blank document. At the top, I typed 3 words, the new beginning. I didn't know yet what it meant. But it was mine. And that was enough for now. The first real idea came to me over coffee. Not the kind you make absent-mindedly in the morning, but the sort you brew slowly because you're trying to think. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after my layoff, and the sky had that heavy gray color that always made the office lights seem warmer. I missed that glow, but not the people who stood beneath it. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing a few of my old process documents, when I realized that half the inefficiencies I'd solved over the years were still problems everywhere else. mid-sized companies struggling to scale, hiring consultants who barely understood their operations. I'd taught that skill for decades. Why couldn't I sell it myself? The thought startled me. I'd spent my entire career inside someone else's structure. To imagine building one of my own felt rebellious, almost indecent, like stepping out of line. But rebellion, it turned out, was exactly what I needed. I called Leo that afternoon. If someone wanted to start a small operations consultancy, I asked, what's the first step? He chuckled. That depends. Do they want to play it safe or actually make a difference? I've done safe for 34 years, I said. Then start small, he replied. One client, one success story. Momentum will do the rest. By evening, I had a name. Renaissance Systems. It sounded too grand for a one-woman project, but I loved how it whispered of renewal. I registered the domain, sketched a logo, and wrote a mission statement in the same notebook where I used to jot meeting notes. We help companies rediscover what they've forgotten. Efficiency with empathy. Those 3 words, efficiency, rediscover, empathy, felt like the heart of everything I'd lost and wanted to regain. The next few weeks were a blur of coffee shop meetings and cautious outreach. I sent messages to old colleagues, careful not to sound desperate. Some never replied. Others wrote polite encouragements with no offers. But one afternoon, a small manufacturing firm emailed back. They were growing faster than their systems could handle. They couldn't afford a big consulting house, but they could afford me. When I stepped into their modest office, I felt the air shift. The CEO, a young man named Ethan, greeted me nervously. I looked you up, he said. Your experience is intimidating. I take that as a compliment, I smiled. The project lasted 6 weeks. I rebuilt their scheduling system, mentored their staff, and left them running smoother than they'd ever been. When Ethan handed me the final payment, he said, You made this place feel human again. That night, as I transferred the funds into my small business account, I felt something I hadn't in months: control. From there, the calls began to spread. A friend of Ethan's, then another referral. By autumn, Renaissance Systems had a modest waiting list. I hired a part-time assistant, Clara, a single mother in her 40s who reminded me of myself 20 years earlier. Together, we built something solid, piece by piece. But fate, as always, has a sense of irony. One morning, Clara brought me a file. Potential acquisition client, she said, tapping the cover. Struggling operations, aging infrastructure, internal conflict. They're looking for a rescue. I opened the file and froze. The company name stared back at me like a ghost from another life. Vantage Dynamics, my old employer. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My coffee went cold beside me. The report was brutal. Plummeting morale. Lost clients. A failed rebranding campaign. The fresher image Melissa had built had collapsed under its own gloss. They were hemorrhaging talent and cash. Clara noticed my silence. Should I tell them no? I shook my head slowly. No, let's hear what they're offering. That night, I sat in my study staring at the file. My heart thudded between satisfaction and sorrow. There it was, the same company that had told me I was too old now, desperately searching for wisdom. And by a twist of fate, I was in the position to offer it, but something in me hesitated. This wasn't about revenge. I'd promised myself that. If I went back, it had to be for the right reason, to build, not to gloat. I reached out to Leo again. They want a buyer, I told him. Or a partner with operational capital, he chuckled low. And you have both. Barely. Barely as a start. You'd need partners. So we began sketching numbers, calling contacts, mapping possibilities. By the next month, I wasn't just consulting, I was negotiating. A small consortium of investors agreed to back me if I led the turnaround. It was reckless, terrifying, exhilarating. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had fired me for being too old to innovate. Now my innovation might save them. On the evening before the final negotiation meeting, I stood by my window again. The streetlights shimmered across the pavement, soft and gold. I thought about all the versions of myself that had walked this path. The humiliated one, the grieving one, the tentative entrepreneur. All of them had led to this woman now, standing steady, unafraid of silence. In the stillness, I whispered a quiet promise. Not to the company, not even to my younger self, but to the women who would come after me. You are never too old to begin again. You're only too afraid. Tomorrow, I would walk back through those familiar glass doors, not as an employee, but as a potential owner. and this time the clock on the wall would keep my time. The morning of the acquisition meeting, I woke before sunrise. The house was still and blue, that in-between color the world takes on before the day declares itself. I made coffee, pressed my blazer, and watched steam rise through the kitchen light. My hands were steady, surprisingly steady. It had been 6 months since I'd last stepped inside Vantage Dynamics, the company that once defined my life and then discarded it like an outdated spreadsheet. Now I was returning not as a casualty, but as possibility. When I arrived, the receptionist didn't recognize me. She smiled politely, asked if I had an appointment. For a brief moment, I considered telling her I used to run half the operations in this building, but I didn't. There was dignity in being underestimated. Inside the boardroom sat 4 faces I remembered too well, Melissa Kane among them. She looked almost relieved to see me, though she didn't yet know why. "Diana," she said, her voice rehearsed. "How wonderful to see you. I've heard you've been consulting." "Something like that," I replied. The negotiation began formally. Numbers, liabilities, timelines. My partners joined via video call, calm and pragmatic. The company's value had fallen further than even the report suggested. Their so-called innovation had fractured morale. Departments worked in isolation. Clients fled. At one point, Melissa sighed. "We just need leadership that understands both the old and the new." I met her eyes. "Then you've called the right person." When the signatures were done, I walked out into the hallway feeling weightless. The building smelled the same: coffee, printer ink, and the faint metallic tang of ambition. But everything felt different. Ownership shifts perception. Suddenly, every light bulb and carpet stain mattered again, but this time on my terms. The next week was a blur of transition meetings. My new title, Chief Executive Officer, felt surreal on the door. Some employees stared when I introduced myself at the first all-staff gathering. Others smiled cautiously, whispering recognition. "I know some of you remember me," I began. "And some of you may only know the version of me that existed in company archives. But I want to talk about what we've all lost, and what we can still rebuild." I paused, scanning their faces. Young analysts, mid-career managers, a handful of veterans who'd survived every reorg. "When I was let go last year," I continued, "I thought the end of my career meant the end of my purpose. But purpose doesn't vanish. It just changes form. This company forgot its own purpose: people. Efficiency without empathy is just machinery. We can do better." The room was silent. Then, somewhere near the back, someone began to clap. The sound spread, cautious at first, then gathering like a wave. Afterward, a few employees lingered to introduce themselves. One woman, Sarah, mid-20s, told me quietly, "My mother went through the same thing. She was pushed out of her job for being too experienced. Thank you for saying what no one else does." That night, I sat alone in my new office. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace that didn't need permission. I thought of the woman I'd been, the one who walked out humiliated with a cardboard box, and I wanted to tell her that the story didn't end in that parking lot. Running the company wasn't easy. Every day brought another reminder of how fragile success could be. But I built a new culture, one that honored experience as much as innovation. We paired young analysts with veteran mentors. We scrapped the sterile, brand refresh slogans and replaced them with 3 simple values painted in the lobby: respect, renewal, results. One afternoon, I caught Melissa standing by that sign. She turned when she saw me, awkward, uncertain. "You've done good work here," she said softly. "Better than I ever did." I studied her face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by fatigue and maybe regret. "We all learn," I said. "Sometimes the hard way." Later that week, she resigned. I wrote her a recommendation letter anyway. Grace isn't about who deserves it. It's about who you choose to be. By the end of the quarter, Vantage Dynamics was profitable again. The investors were pleased. But what mattered more was the mood in the hallways, the laughter, the small celebrations, the sense that people believed in something again. On the last day of that fiscal year, I stayed late, wandering through the now quiet offices. The silver clock still hung on the wall, ticking faithfully. I touched its cool frame and smiled. It had seen my fall and my return. Time, after all, had been my ally, not my enemy. I stood by the window, watching the lights of the city blink like scattered stars, and felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. The world hadn't ended when they called me too old. It had simply paused, waiting for me to claim it differently. And as I turned off the lights and closed the office door behind me, I realized this wasn't the same company anymore. It wasn't even the same woman. It was both. Rebuilt, reborn, renewed. 6 months into running Vantage Dynamics, the hum of the office had changed. Conversations carried warmth instead of fear. Ideas spilled instead of whispered. The quarterly numbers showed recovery, but the real victory was invisible. People smiled again. Then came the email. Subject line: Professional reference request. I almost deleted it without opening. The sender's name stopped me. Melissa Kane. For a long moment, I stared at the screen. The woman who once told me I was too old to lead a fresh brand was now asking if I could speak to her leadership, integrity, and strategic capabilities for a potential new employer. The irony hit like a gust of cold air. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the low murmur of the office outside. Somewhere, someone laughed, a bright, full sound I hadn't heard here in years. And in that laughter, I found my answer forming quietly inside me. I didn't hate Melissa. Not anymore. Anger had burned out long ago, replaced by something steadier: clarity. Still, I couldn't help but remember the day she'd watched me pack that box, the way her polished smile had barely trembled. Fresher identity. New direction. The phrases had sliced through me like polite knives. And now here she was, adrift, searching for validation from the very person she'd dismissed. I could write the reference. I could ignore it. Or I could decide what kind of woman I wanted to be in this new chapter. That night, I called Leo. You'll never guess who emailed me. He chuckled when I told him. So what are you going to do? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to remind her what she cost me. And the other part? The other part wants to show her what I found because of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then show her that. Grace is power, Diana, not weakness. The next morning, I drafted my response. Melissa, I appreciate you reaching out. I can confirm that during our time together, you demonstrated creativity, energy, and a strong drive for progress. I trust that you've continued to grow from every challenge, just as I have. I wish you success wherever your next chapter takes you. Warm regards, Diana Wren Novenum. No triumph. Just truth wrapped in civility. When I hit send, I felt the last thread of bitterness loosen. Revenge gives relief, but forgiveness gives release. Later that week, Melissa called. I didn't expect that. I wanted to thank you, she said softly. You didn't have to write anything. No, I replied, but sometimes doing what we don't have to do is what makes us human. There was a pause, heavy, sincere. You were always better at this than I was, she whispered. Then the line clicked off. Afterward, I walked through the production floor, greeting the team. The scent of coffee, the hum of machines, the low chatter, it all felt alive again. I watched young analysts shadowing older supervisors, learning that experience wasn't an anchor but a sail. As I passed one workstation, Sarah stopped me. Hey, Diana, Melissa just posted that she got a job at a nonprofit startup. Said she's focusing on mentorship programs for women re-entering the workforce. I smiled. Good. Maybe she's learning what it means to start over. That night, I went home early for once. My husband had set the table, candles flickering beside a simple meal. We ate slowly, laughing about small things, the kind of laughter that comes only after long storms have cleared. After dinner, I found myself scrolling through old photos again. In one of them, a much younger me stood in front of the Vantage Dynamics sign, full of purpose. I looked at her and whispered, "We made it back, not the same, but better." Then, my phone buzzed. An email from an unfamiliar address. A journalist requesting an interview about the remarkable turnaround story led by a CEO defying corporate age bias. I laughed softly. The story had written itself, apparently. The next day during the interview, the reporter asked, what was the hardest part about taking back control? Letting go of the need to prove anything, I said. Once you stop fighting to be seen, you can start building again. And what's your biggest lesson? That wisdom ages well, I replied. If you let it. When the article was published, messages poured in, from women, men, young interns, retirees, each one saying the same thing. Thank you for reminding us that it's never too late. But the moment that stayed with me wasn't the publicity. It was walking into the office that Friday morning, seeing the sunlight spill across the new motto painted above the lobby doors. Experience is our future. It wasn't my idea. The staff had done it themselves. I stood there, hand over my heart, feeling something gentle and vast move through me. The ghosts of the old world, the humiliation, the anger, the fear were still there, but now they stood quietly, like lessons finally learned. I didn't need to banish them. I only needed to understand them because the truth was simple. The past doesn't vanish when you win. It stands behind you, proud whispering, see? You survived. It started with a ripple, not a roar. One article turned into 3. Then a podcast called Corporate Reborn asked if I'd share how you redefined leadership after being written off. I said yes, but quietly. I didn't want fame. I wanted truth. When the host introduced me as Diana Wren, the CEO who turned dismissal into destiny, I almost laughed. If they had seen me that day years ago, cardboard box in hand, heart cracking behind polite nods, they would have known destiny looked nothing like this. It looked like loss, but the interview went live and something shifted. My inbox flooded, not with investors or clients, but with people. A 62-year-old nurse pushed out of a hospital she'd served for decades. A father whose startup wouldn't hire him because his LinkedIn photo showed gray hair. A 30-year-old saying, "If this is what getting older looks like, I'm not afraid anymore." Justice didn't arrive in a courtroom. It came through stories echoing mine. A week later, I was invited to a business ethics summit, ironically, hosted at the same conference center where my old company once celebrated Youth Innovation Week. I accepted. When I walked in, the scent of coffee and fresh brochures felt eerily familiar. But this time, I wasn't a discarded manager hiding her hurt. I was the keynote speaker. The banner behind the stage read, "Redefining Agility, Wisdom as a Competitive Edge." Before going on stage, I spotted Melissa near the back row. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in certainty. She caught my eye, nodded once, then looked away. That was enough. We didn't need words anymore. We'd already said everything that mattered in silence. When my turn came, I stepped to the microphone. 5 years ago, I was told my experience made me outdated, that the world was moving too fast for people like me. So I slowed down, and that's how I caught what everyone else was missing. The room was quiet. Even the lights seemed to soften. I learned that innovation without memory is chaos, and memory without courage is regret. The bridge between them is called growth. Applause swelled, gentle but steady, like rain building to a storm. In that sound, I heard vindication. Not for me alone, but for every person ever told they'd outlived their worth. Afterward, reporters asked if I planned to expand Vantage Dynamics abroad. I smiled. Yes, I said, but carefully. Some roots need tending before they stretch. Later in the lobby, a young woman approached me. "Ms. Wren, my mother lost her job last year. She hasn't left the house since. I played her your talk live. She's packing a suitcase. She says she wants to start something new." I felt my throat tighten. "Tell her," I said, "the world still needs her hands." That night, alone in my hotel room, I opened the balcony doors. The city below glittered, alive with movement. Somewhere in those lights was the building where my old office used to be. I wondered what it looked like now. Different logo, different faces, same glass walls, and I wondered if they ever thought about me. My phone buzzed again, an alert from the business ledger. Former manager reclaims company. Redefines corporate age narrative, justice. Not revenge, justice. The kind that doesn't demand an apology but quietly rewrites the ending. A few weeks later, I hosted a press event at our new headquarters. Employees stood behind me as cameras flashed. Vantage Dynamics is launching the Legacy Lab, I announced. A mentorship program pairing senior professionals with young innovators. We believe that experience and curiosity belong at the same table. Applause again, this time from my own people. One reporter asked, "Is this your way of responding to age discrimination?" I smiled. It's my way of preventing it. After the conference, Melissa approached me. "Diana," she said softly, "I wanted to say congratulations." "Thank you," I replied. She hesitated. "You've built something good." "So can you," I said. Her eyes glistened. "I'm trying." We stood there for a moment, two women bound by one wound, now healed in different ways. When she left, I realized justice isn't always about who wins. It's about what grows after loss. That night, I walked through the office again, long after everyone had gone home. The lights reflected off the glass, turning the city outside into a watercolor of gold and shadow. I thought of the younger version of me, the one who had cried quietly in her car, gripping a pink slip she didn't deserve. I whispered into the empty air. We did it. Justice, I've learned, doesn't arrive with a gavel. It arrives in peace. The morning light poured through my office window, soft and gold, brushing over the framed photo of the team on launch day. Their faces, some young, some weathered, blurred slightly in the sun. I'd once thought leadership was about being the strongest voice in the room. Now I knew it was about listening until others found theirs. I arrived early that day, earlier than usual. The city was still waking, the streets whispering with the hum of deliveries and coffee carts. I carried no laptop, no stack of reports, just a small box of envelopes tied with twine. Inside were handwritten notes, each one for someone who had helped me rebuild Vantage Dynamics. To Sarah, for reminding me that courage looks good on everyone. To Leo, for believing before I did. To the night custodian, Roberto, for saying good morning to me that first week when no one else did. Each name carried a story. Each story was proof that grace doesn't appear in grand gestures. It blooms quietly, one kindness at a time. By 9, the office filled with laughter and footsteps. I called everyone to the central lounge. The room smelled of fresh pastries and printer ink. I have something to share, I began, feeling the warmth of 100 eyes on me. I told them I was stepping down as CEO. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a stunned silence. It's not the end, I said quickly. It's just time to let new hands steer what we've built. Leadership isn't possession, it's stewardship. Sarah's eyes glistened. You can't just leave, Diana. I'm not leaving, I smiled. I'm making space. I announced that the board had voted for her as the next CEO. The applause came like a wave, loud, full, and unrestrained. She covered her mouth, trembling. You trust me? With everything, I said. You're the future I once feared. And the proof that I was never too old, just waiting for the right time. After the meeting, I walked alone to the rooftop garden we'd built during renovations. The city stretched before me like a living mosaic, steel and sunlight, motion and memory. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. This was what peace felt like. Not the absence of struggle, but the gentle hum that follows it. My phone buzzed with a message. It was Melissa. Heard about your retirement. Congratulations, truly. You were right. Grace is power. I hope I find mine someday. I smiled and typed back. You already have. You just wrote to say it. Then I tucked the phone away and leaned against the railing. The wind was cool, soft against my hair. Somewhere below, life went on. Emails, deadlines, ambition. But up here, everything felt still. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing, proving, or defending. I was simply being. I thought back to that first humiliation the day they fired me. I could still feel the weight of that cardboard box, the echo of the door closing behind me. But that memory no longer burned. It glowed like a lantern marking where the road began. Pain, when faced long enough, becomes wisdom. Wisdom, when shared freely, becomes grace. I whispered to the city below, "Thank you for letting me start again." A flock of pigeons rose suddenly from a nearby roof, swirling in the sunlight, messy, uncoordinated, yet somehow beautiful. I laughed softly. Maybe we're all like that, I thought, trying to find our flight after the fall. Later that afternoon, Leo met me downstairs. He carried 2 cups of coffee. So, he said, what's next for the woman who bought her old company and made it better? I'm thinking of teaching, I said. Maybe mentoring women in midlife transitions. The Legacy Lab could use real stories, he nodded. You'd be perfect for that. Not perfect, I smiled. Just practiced. We walked out together, hand in hand, into the bright October sun. The doors closed softly behind us, but I didn't look back. Some doors don't need to stay open to remind you you've walked through them. As we reached the street, a young intern ran up, breathless. Ms. Wren, they're asking for a quote for the new company brochure. Something short, something true. I paused, thinking, then said, Tell them. Experience isn't what slows us down. It's what teaches us how to rise. She nodded, beaming, and ran off. I stood for a moment longer, watching her disappear into the crowd. My reflection flickered in the building's glass. Older, yes, but softer, steadier, luminous in a way I hadn't been before. That was the gift of it all. Not revenge. Not recognition. Just the quiet knowing that I'd lived long enough to see the wound become the wisdom. And that was enough. If this story touched your heart, follow and subscribe to Kindred Echo, where every heartbreak finds its voice and every lesson blooms again.